below by their workers, the task is a challenging one indeed. And I think it's important to point out that established trade unions have had great difficulty adapting to the types of work, the contractual agreements, and the new types of workers that are prevalent in these industries. There are, however, signs that workers in the creative industries are beginning to confront the conditions that they're faced with and organize collectively and fight back against them. So, in what remains of my talk, what I want to do is just survey some of these. And here I'm drawing from the 3-year research project that was previously mentioned with my colleague Greg Deputer and Nicole Cohen. And what we're doing is we're seeking to document and assess some of these emergent forms of labor organization taken by workers in these industries in order to confront these labor conditions that are exceptionally difficult. And again, I don't want to suggest that the labor conditions for all workers in these industries are difficult. I think some people in these industries have conditions of work that are very similar to what Richard Florida mentions. But this is the kind of the classic 1 in 100, I think, and this is a pattern that's repeated in many industries, including my own in academia. We have some people who have very good working conditions, and many who don't. I think that the labor politics and activism that are occurring at the margins of the established trade union movement are really, really promising. And I think that within them, we can find the seeds of a kind of a recomposition of labor movements for the 21st century. Again, trying to think optimistically here. Among the unions and professional associations representing workers at the higher end of the value chain, the best example is the Freelancers Union in the United States, an organization that now counts over 170,000 members and that bills itself as a union of independent workers. Now, while steering clear of a conflictual rhetoric, the organization founded by Sarah Horowitz offers a clear example of the ways in which a really fragmented and dispersed group of workers can be gathered together into an association that has the potential to turn the tables on their employers. But there's also great innovation coming from more informal grassroots workers' associations in the creative industries. One of the most exciting ones that we've been collaborating with is the San Vicario network in Milan. This is the patron saint of precarious workers. They put together, of course, Italian activism at its finest. The San Vicario network has been organizing among precariously employed workers in that city for now 10 or 15 years, and they've been a key force between yearly May Day parades, which are expressly for precariously employed workers, and which attract over 100,000 workers every May Day. This is particularly impressive because the major trade unions are actually not allowed to participate because they are assumed to be blind to the problems of precariously employed workers. Whether or not this is actually the case, we can discuss, but I think this event is meant to give visibility to a group of workers which is really dispersed. They don't meet in a factory together every day. They work at a distance from each other. And so events like this are designed to give visibility, and they have now spread to over 20 cities in Europe and has now spread beyond Europe. So, interns are beginning to organize too. This is one of my favorite images that emerged from the Occupy Wall Street demonstration. In recent years, associations representing interns have been formed wherever the creative industries are strong, including Intern Aware in Britain, Intern Labor Rights in the US, Génération Précaire in France, La Repubblica degli Stagisti in Italy, and more recently the Canadian Intern Association. So even interns are beginning to organize. A very kind of small, these are fledgling organizations. One of the areas of labor activity that we're beginning to track is what we're referring to as institutional innovations in the creative industries. For example, it appears as if there's a small but healthy area of activity in the formation of cooperatives by workers in the creative industries, particularly in the United Kingdom. And another of the more interesting practices that are beginning to be adopted by flex workers in these sectors is the development of co-working spaces in urban areas across the world. Again, these are spaces where freelancers who traditionally are dispersed can begin to come together and work together and share and circulate their problems that they're facing. While we were in Italy in May of this year, we were also witness to an even more audacious form of collective organization. Cultural workers in Milan, tired of having no guarantees in a sector that's been devastated by the financial crisis and public cuts to cultural funding in Italy, occupied a skyscraper in the heart of the city and went to work reclaiming it as a space for the production of culture from below. This is the first meeting that was held in the occupied skyscraper. It's literally 35 floors. And they occupied it in order to run it autonomously as a group of cultural workers and no longer be dependent on an economy that cannot guarantee them jobs. This occupation has actually followed on the heels of several others in Italy, from Palermo to Turin to Rome. In Rome, in the Teatro Valle, this is a theater and opera house that dates back to 1726. It's right in the center of the city. It was occupied by its workers in 2010, and it's now still being run independently by them. They decided to occupy it when the Berlusconi government cut funds to it and was going to privatize it. So it's now still run by workers themselves. So these types of really desperate measures, I think, that are being taken by cultural workers are actually becoming more common in times of financial crisis. We haven't seen them as much here in North America, but we have more cuts on the way. I think finally one of the areas that we could discuss of labor activity which we're tracking is the development of a series of new policy proposals that are trying to imagine a new form of welfare which is adequate to a world defined by precarious employment. These proposals are sometimes gathered under the umbrella of flexicurity, and they're at their most ambitious in the idea of a basic income. This is a universal, unconditional income capable of covering basic human need and mitigating a world in which discontinuous income is actually a way of life. I think this surge of activism is tremendously inspiring given the really difficult conditions that are faced by cultural workers. We live at a time when individualism and competitiveness are so highly prized that literally making connections on LinkedIn is often like the closest we get to collective action in the workplace. But history is an important guide for us. I think the selfish, individualist 1920s came just before the Great Depression, which triggered one of the most tremendous waves of labor activism that we've seen. One that established trade unions in factories, but more than in factories, it also established them in the cultural industries of that era. And I think that, once again, an only truly democratic set of cultural industries and creative industries can only be created from below by its workforce. Thank you.
And a wonderful overview of what's happening with work in creative industries and communications. Mark, Catherine?
Well, I think I'll start before throwing to Catherine. We do want to talk a bit about, especially about internships and Catherine's position for that. But I want to pick up on a couple of things that Linda talked about. Just from a more practical point of view, he's done the research. I frankly lived it for the past 25 years, and I was shocked to find out, before I started full-time in the newsroom in the mid-90s, I worked as a part-timer on weekends there, and I worked as a freelancer with various production companies. And at the end of that, I was pretty busy, and my rate was $500 a day. That rate hasn't changed. It's still $500 a day for top-of-the-line workers in Toronto and Vancouver. In 15 years, that rate hasn't changed. I was shocked to find that out. But it speaks to how, and to talk about, new ways of organizing workers and binding us together as citizens, not just as workers, not as consumers, or as Catherine was talking about earlier, as taxpayers, as citizens. In order to have a healthy economy, in order to have a healthy country, in order to have a healthy life, you need to have the kind of basic citizen rights that say, there's a certain basic fairness here. And it's time to change the conversation back. And I think Occupy started to do that. Whether you call it Occupy, whether you use the rhetoric from the 30s about, seizing the means of production. I'm a union guy, so, I got to use my commie phrases here. But it's the same principle, right? We do a fair day's work. We should be paid a fair day's wage. And to suggest that we can't afford it, well, certainly under the current system, you're right, we can't afford it. But that's because of the imbalance within the system, And so it's important to bring it back to working within media. It's important to look at what we can and cannot afford, and it's important, I think, to change the conversation. And rather than talking about hanging on to, what we have. Like my job is now, I negotiate contracts. So to answer the first question about, does this fit the traditional definition of labor? Labor is employment. Yeah, my answer is yes, it does. And Enda talked about, at the end of his talk, about how individualism, just before the Great Depression, triggered, the labor movement, and a lot of battles were fought. And there was some agreement, a social contract was formed. And that contract, the RAND formula, and those sorts of contracts meant that there's a partnership between labor, workers, and management, a partnership between citizens and government. And it's only when that's a true partnership that you can have a healthy country, healthy citizens, healthy lifestyle, healthy economy. And frankly, it's gotten a little out of whack. And to talk about context, and context is important, especially in media. I worked in television. We're not great at context. We can, show you the fire and make it feel like you're there behind the police lines or whatever. But we're not great at context. But I think if you're going to talk about the democracy in media, it's important to look at context and to look at how the conversation has been changing since the mid-'80s. To go back to Thatcher and Reagan. And I'm not citing those as big bugaboos. I'm just saying that they managed to successfully change the conversation. And here we are, 25, 30 years later, and that conversation has almost run its course. And the Occupy movement is the pendulum swinging back, and us starting to change the conversation back. Us starting to change the conversation back. The important thing, my final point, the important thing to realize is that the airwaves are a resource that belong to the